Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Barb Thomas, and I'm a professor in forest genetics at the U of A and hold an industrial research chair in tree improvement. I wanted to start by giving you a little background about TIA before introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Greg O'Neill. TIA was formed about 10 years ago already, with an overall goal of advancing forest genetics and tree improvement in Alberta through coordinating, implementing, and supporting collaborative research projects to maximize the efficiency among our members and collaborators. We also work to facilitate communication among growth and yield, silviculture, and tree improvement interests. We're currently a project team within FGrOW with 15 members and a board of directors, including our current chair, Jeff Morris, past chair, Dave Swindlehurst, Dia Gracias, Rowan Giza, Christine Quinn, Peggy Pike, Rob Stronach, and myself. Our board represents industry, government, and academia, as well as both conifer and deciduous interests, and our program manager is Jeremy Beal. This fall, TIA will again be hosting a strategic planning session. The last one was held in 2017, to refocus our efforts and define new topic areas to pursue. A date is not set yet, so please watch your emails and do plan to attend. More recently, a letter was distributed to our membership in March, reiterating the need for coordinated advancement of tree improvement in Alberta using one voice. As we no longer have an active Forest Genetics Council in Alberta, it's where we are hoping to help to coordinate any issues, concerns, and ideas through TIA. With this general overview, I'd like to now introduce our speaker and also thank FGrOW for providing the hosting services for today with Brian Roth, and also with Ben and Terry and the team at FRI who have helped with this. So many of you I know Greg, but we'll just give him a little biography sketch here. Greg's a climate change adaptation scientist, and the focus of Greg's research is on understanding the nature and distribution of adaptive variation in BC's tree species, and applying this understanding to reforestation practices to help ensure BC's forest plantations remain healthy and productive in new climates. Greg is a professional forester with degrees in biology, forest ecology, and forest genetics. He's worked in environmental consulting, international development, seedling production, and for the last 20 years, in the forest genetics section of the Forest Improvement and Research Management branch of the BC government. And he is located in Vernon, BC. He did spend some time in Vancouver, where we were also grad students together many years ago. Greg's talk today is titled Pining for Home, Seed Source Selection for Future Forests. So please join me in welcoming Greg.
Thanks very much, Barb. Yeah, those were fun times in grad school. And thank you very much for the invitation to present today. So before I get started, we could call this Seed Trek, the next generation, because that's really what I'm talking about, is the next generation of seedlot selection systems. But even before I get going, I want everybody to try to think climatically. It'll make this presentation make a whole lot more sense. So what you're looking at is it's a very special slide. It's actually a hologram. Maybe you don't recognize it, but it's truly a hologram. So if you stare right at the center of this slide, say right close to Athabasca, and just relax your eyes and stare at Athabasca and just give your brain permission to go where it will. And some of you might notice a sudden switch from this geographic-based map to a climate-based map. So this is the climate-based map. Hopefully everybody's brains have made the switch. We're no longer going to think with geographic-based maps with longitude and latitude, but rather with temperature and precipitation. So here's the new map of Alberta. And just for reference, I put on there Deep Creek, one of our test sites, just half an hour north of Vernon, up about at about 1,200 meters. And it's a virtual neighbor to Pincher Creek, some, I don't know, 900 kilometers away. Okay, so we're thinking climatically. So I'm going to speak very briefly about some of the impacts of climate change and just give a brief introduction to the notion of assisted migration. I'll spend most of my time talking about climate-based seed transfer and assisted migration systems, and then a little bit about the BC experience of building and implementing a CBST assisted migration system. All right, so not to belabor the point, I'm sure you've all seen either these slides or many slides very similar, and they, oops, sorry. So we see Dothostroma, yellow cedar decline, spruce and aspen dieback, drought mortality, spruce beetle, mountain pine beetle. So these are just some examples of disturbance that we've seen recently that have been linked to assisted migration. So those are some of the impacts, but we also can more quantify some of the impacts by using provenance tests. And we're fortunate to have a very well-developed provenance test called the Illingworth Lodgepole Pine Provenance Test. It contains 60 populations, pardon me, 140 populations tested at 60 locations. And on the left of this slide, you can see an example of one of those populations tested at 2 locations. A cold population, minus 1.3 degrees mean annual temperature, tested at home, and that same population tested in a climate that's 4.2 degrees warmer than its origin. So on the left, we have a straight tree, no disease. Well, you can't see it obviously, but I took the photo, so I can attest that the crown is very full and straight. And here we have a fork, another fork here, and in this tree in the background, forks as well. So this is what the future will look like if we continue along the path of local is best in our reforestation practices. We can take all of the data from this Illingworth trial and use it to develop maps like this. We know the climate of the seed source. We know the climate of the test site. So we can calculate the transfer distance. And then we can build a model that predicts lodgepole pine productivity. And we also know the productivity of each population at each test site. So we can build a model that predicts productivity, spatially explicit model of productivity. Then we can substitute future climates into that model to get an indication of what the future might hold for lodgepole pine. And the future's not pretty for lodgepole pine if we continue to plant local. So this is some work that Gord Nye and I did. He's recently retired growth and yield modeler with the Ministry of Forests in BC. And we took that same lodgepole pine Illingworth data and we developed a pooled transfer function. So we took all the sites, pooled them together, and we notice we see here is that productivity declines regardless of which direction you move your seed. If you move it to colder sites or if you move your seed to warmer sites, your productivity declines. Local is best, and the populations from cold climates perform, they lose productivity more quickly when they're moved or when the climate warms. Now we can take this transfer function and we know with a given increase in temperature, how much productivity we're going to lose, how much height we're going to lose. We can then use this transfer function to tweak the height over age curve. So that's what we did here, and we see that different general circulation models and different populations yield different height over age curves. All of them are perform more poorly than does the no climate change scenario with local seed. We can then take that height over age function and substitute it into TAS, BC's growth model, and develop a age over volume function. So that's what we see here. But I want to point out that these impacts are almost certainly considerably underestimated because they don't include pest impacts, and nor do they include their only growth. They don't take into consideration survival. So that's a project we have underway right now. So, okay, so and just one final point. So here we see that site index is no longer static over time. So we should be thinking that yeah, site index is going to change because the climate is changing and because the performance of the populations changes over time. And site index is a function of seed source as well. Okay, so that's the end of the bad news. The good news is that there is something we can do about it. So this is Canada's plant hardiness zone map that you might see if you go to your local horticulture shop and buy some azaleas. Now, most plants at most horticultural shops have a rating, a plant hardiness rating, and that rating is effectively the minimum temperature. So we can see that those plant hardiness ratings get colder as you go north. So you get you need more resistant stock if you're planting in these blue and purple zones than you do if you're planting in the green and the yellow. But we also see when this model is backcast using climate from this period here, 31 to 60, we see that just how far those climate those hardiness zones have shifted. You know, we're looking at 800 kilometers that they've already shifted. So this should make reforestation folks stop in their tracks for a second and just think about, you know, why are we planting local if our climate models are showing a 600 or 800 kilometer northward shift. All right, just to extend some of this work, so Gord Nye then went on to take that growth model that we developed. He tweaked it slightly, and then he was able to look at the productivity of, again, local population with no climate change up top here, and then the local population with climate change, you know, a slight decrease in height and you know, probably 2 or 2.5 times in decrease in volume. But then he looked at, well, what about, you know, he ran a bunch of populations, and superimposed on top of this solid line is this dashed line. So he was able to recover all the height loss from climate change by planting a local, by planting the optimal population. And that's what we see over here. So each intersection point on this massive grid is a candidate seed source, which he tested. And he found that by selecting populations from slightly warmer and from slightly wetter locations, that he could recuperate the forfeiture in losses associated with climate change. So he wrote, in this example, growth reductions associated with climate change can be fully mitigated by planting the optimal seed source. Now, again, this does not take into account pests or fire, obviously, and it does not account for direct losses associated with survival. All right, so now a lot of folks will challenge assisted migration on the grounds that, well, what if you move your seed too far? Well, I mean, that's a real concern, and I have I had a photo here which showed what happens when you move Douglas fir from Arizona to Vernon, and it's not pretty. So yeah, of course, moving seed too far is if you move seed too far, it's going to die. If you don't move seed far enough, you're not accomplishing anything in terms of mitigating climate change impacts. So, what's the sweet point? Well, the sweet point is well, we're going to talk about that in just a few seconds. But the point is that this should not be a barrier to assisted migration, because we have these tools at our disposal that will avoid transfers that are too far. Species invasion. This is a real and very serious risk for many species in many parts of the world. I'm sure all of our listeners right now could come up with a long list of species invasions. However, when we're talking about assisted migration, at least in the context of forestry in Canada, we are generally not talking about importing species from abroad. We're talking about moving seed sources 400, 600, 800 kilometers north, or 300, 400, 500 meters uphill. Basically 2 or 2.5 degrees mean annual temperature. So, and in addition, wherever we've seen these significant species invasions, invariably they involve intercontinental species movement. And finally, very few species invasions have involved conifers. So I think the risks are exceedingly slow when it comes to species invasions. Another category of risk associated with assisted migration is the so-called hitchhiking pathogens or hitchhiking insects. And white pine blister rust is an obvious example. Southeast BC 100 years ago was dominated by beautiful beautiful stands of white pine, which were decimated by the introduction of white pine blister rust. But when we're talking about assisted migration in the context of Canadian forestry, we are not talking about importing seed sources or seedlings from abroad, as was the case here and in virtually all situations where we're talking about hitchhiking pathogens or insects. We're using the same materials from the same nurseries. We're simply getting the seed from a few 100 kilometers further south. Okay, let's talk about climate-based seed transfer systems. So these dots on the left, with the exception of these 3 dots on the right, these are all observed. These are all taken from weather records. These 3 dots are predicted. So this is the trajectory of climate, of mean annual temperature in Edmonton from 1910 to 2080. So here we are today. So given that there's very good evidence that trees migrate across populations of trees migrate across the landscape at a rate of about 1/10 to 1/100th the speed with which climate change is migrating across the landscape. Given that, we should expect to see an evolutionary lag. And evolutionary lags are, can also be termed, maladapted, or they result in maladaptation. Trees bursting bud at the wrong time, setting bud at the wrong time, lacking resistance to pests. So if you're a forester in Edmonton and you know that the climate has increased by 2 degrees, the mean annual temperature has increased by 2 degrees, would you plant local seed? Well, no. You'd want to plant seed from an area that's 2 degrees warmer than Edmonton, because trees from 2 degrees warmer than Edmonton evolved in a climate that Edmonton has today. So if Edmonton has a 4 degrees temperature today, you'd go somewhere with a 6 degree temperature, because those trees evolved in 4 degrees. Okay, great. So now you're planting trees that are optimally adapted to today, but they're going to be in the ground for 80 or 100 years. Well, 80 or 100 years from now, we're talking about, climates up here. So if you were to plant trees that were optimally adapted to, 7 or 8 degrees, they probably wouldn't fare very well at establishment. So clearly, we want to migrate trees to somewhere between today's climate and climate at rotation. In BC, we opted to go for a quarter of the rotation because trees are most sensitive at establishment. So this is our attempt to balance the need for survival at establishment, but continued productivity toward the end of the rotation. When we add those two distances together, we get what we call the migration distance. And we calculate this migration distance for 6 climate variables. Now, the nice thing about using migration distance to figure out how far should we migrate our seed in assisted migration, the nice thing about that is that it can be very easily and accurately calculated thanks to lots of good weather station data and climate NA. So the next thing we need to think about when it comes to implementing a climate-based seed transfer system is which type of system to use. Well, here we have 3 types of systems. So this is my attempted sketch of some hypothetical jurisdiction, and I've divided this jurisdiction into 7 seed zones. So in this top left seed zone, we have a cut block. With a fixed zone seed transfer system, we can procure seed from anywhere within this large fixed zone, which is great. It very simply administered. But if your cut block is, right next to a border, you can't go across the border to get your seed, because seed that's in a zone stays in a zone. So that's a handicap of the fixed zone system. And fixed zone systems are, BC, pardon me, we are getting rid of our fixed zone systems in a week. So this is our fixed zone system for Douglas fir and for wild seed for natural stand seedlots. Washington State, Oregon State, Idaho, Montana, Southeast states, California, Mexico, Britain, Kenya, the state of Weyerhaeuser, they all have fixed zone systems. So fixed zone systems are great in that they allow for maximum deployability of the seed, but they don't allow for, sorry, let me just, focal point systems, I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm getting this a little bit mixed up. So okay, so these are the fixed zone systems, and they don't allow us to move across the border. So that's the limitation to these fixed zone systems. Focal point systems, on the other hand, resolve that barrier, because in focal point systems, you can always move seed the maximum distance. So these arrows are intended, or this oval is intended to represent some geographic or climatic threshold beyond which seed must not be transferred. So it often results in these non-contiguous polygons, but it's a much more refined system. So every time you move your cut block a kilometer to the east, your oval then switches. So you have an infinite number of procurement areas for that cut block. Beautiful system. That the problem with administering a system like that is that it doesn't lend itself to rolling up to calculate, how much seed do you have for, the Southeast Alberta, or there's no forestry in Southeast Alberta, example, but for a certain management area, things don't roll up easily, so you can make predictions for, your seed supply. So that's a handicap. Just to give you an example of one of those systems, here's the seedlot selection tool from Oregon State University. and USDA Forest Service. So here we have the user has selected that I have a cut block mode. There's no, the user enters the species, the climate to which the seed is adapted, the climate to which you want the seed adapted in the future, and the user enters the distance that you think it's safe to move seed. So this is a very user-driven system. And the orange and yellow here represent the climate match between the cut block and all the candidate, all the potential seed procurement areas. So system's been around for a little while. It's being modified to make up for some of the weaknesses. One of the weaknesses in right now is that, how is a user supposed to, discern red from yellow, and just what does, the difference between red and yellow really mean? So yeah, that's a bit of a limitation. And this is the system. So notice here we've switched, we've moved forward. So we're asking the system to select seed sources that are adapted to this period right here, as opposed to the previous slide, which was 61 to 90. So when we move to the forward, so here's the original, and when we move forward, notice that the procurement has moved south a little bit, and if we were to zoom in really closely, you'd see that the procurement areas have also gone downhill a bit. Okay, so that's a focal point system. A focal zone system is a bit of a hybrid between these two, and it uses much smaller zones, and the plantation ecosystem or seed zone can receive seed from any seed zone or ecosystem that has a climate similar to the plantation ecosystem. So here's how our BC's focal zone system works. We have 210 ecosystems or seed zones, and we have them scattered across these two, for representation purposes, across these two climate axes. We have a seed lot in green here, and then in red, pink, we have expected productivity when this seed lot is deployed inside each of these rings. So the darker the red, the higher the productivity. So we call this the seed deployment space. We calculate that multivariate vector of migration distances that I was talking about a few minutes ago, and then we shift the seed deployment space to the head of that arrow. That's all we do. And then we identify all the ecosystems that are inside this oval. Okay, so that's what a seed owner might be thinking about. Where can I deploy my seed? And this is what it would look like on a spatial map. We have the seed source here, and in orange we have all the potential deployment areas. So the system, the user enters, I have a seed lot, the user enters the species and the ecosystem, presses go, and you get a list of the ecosystems where that seed can be deployed. Okay. Now, when the user says, no, yes, I want to use assisted migration. So here's the original with no assisted migration. Here's with assisted migration. The, pardon me, the area of deployment has shifted into slightly colder locations. Now, from the perspective of a forester who has a cut block, we start at the same place. This is where you would deploy your seed if you had no assisted migration. But with assisted migration, we migrate the oval to the right into warmer climates, and this becomes the new seed procurement space. We identify the ecosystems inside the space, and that becomes where you can get your seed from. So here's what it looks like in our little seed lot selection tool. And with assisted migration, now all of a sudden the user is looking for ecosystems that are slightly warmer than the procurement, than the cut block. Okay, so that's how BC's CBST system works. And by the way, this tool is just a tool that we developed for users or for interested parties. It's actually implemented through SPAR, through our seedlot seed planning and registry system. And just before I move on, I just wanted to point out that there's really only two things that we need to do this. The first is, what's the direction and magnitude of this vector? And that's easily calculated from climate NA by knowing the future climate and the climate from, in our case, 1945. So you need to know this vector, but you also need to know, well, the size of this envelope. Well, if you have a seed transfer system, then you have implicitly or maybe explicitly figured out how big you want that, how comfortable you are with moving seed. So the size of the procurement space ideally is calculated from transfer functions, but we already have seed zones. Most forestry jurisdictions have seed zones. So they've made a decision about what a safe seed transfer distance is. So just because we are now shifting from a geographic-based system to a climate-based system doesn't mean that we have a whole new need for provenance tests and transfer functions, because we already have a seed transfer system. So I hope that makes sense. Now, in BC, where we have a lot of provenance tests, we don't have good provenance tests for all of our species. In fact, we've got some pretty crappy provenance tests. They were established, many of them were established in the 60s and 70s and 80s to find sources of good seed. They weren't established for climate change seed transfer purposes. So what we've done in those cases, for about half of our species, is we've borrowed transfer functions from species for which we have good data, mainly lodgepole pine and spruce. Okay, so here's another example of a focal zone system. This is a recently released system in Ontario. Here's the cut block. The cut block is in this seed zone, and the system tells the user that you can procure seed from any of these zones, most of which are in the States, by the way. So, or if you are a seed producer, you have seed, and you want to know where it can be used, the system returns all of these ecosystems. So, good example of a focal zone system. California is just in the process of developing a focal zone system called CAST. The user enters the species, the seed zone, and the elevation band, and the system returns a colored map of other seed zones and the appropriateness of procuring seed from each of those zones for the planting zone. Okay, so just showing just one more slide on how this works. So we start with our ecosystems, or we call them biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification variants. So just seed zones or ecosystems. We know the climate, the mean climate of each ecosystem. So now we have two sets. We have a set for plantations and a set for seed. We put them together to develop this climate distance matrix. So this is just a subset. We actually have 210 ecosystems. So we would have a 210 by 210 matrix, but this is just a subset of them. And each value in here represents the distance from one ecosystem to the next. So for instance, this bunch grass ecosystem, the distance to this tundra ecosystem is a long way. But when you go from let's say one bunch grass to another bunch grass, the distance is much shorter. And of course, from bunch grass XH1 to bunch grass XH1 is 0. We could just stop there, and most jurisdictions do. They, whether they do it explicitly or implicitly, they know the climate, that they have an understanding of what the climate distance between all pairs of ecosystems. And you could just say, well, you know what, we don't have time for this provenance testing stuff. We're just going to stop at, let's say 3. So 3 climate units. And if your value is less than 3, you get a check mark and you can move seed between those ecosystems. But we know that a unit of 3 units is not the same for spruce as it is for pine. Pine is somewhat more sensitive to movement than is spruce. We also know that in cold environments, trees are more sensitive to transfer, as we see here from this transfer function for lodgepole pine. The red line is for seed sources from cold sites, whereas the blue is from the warmer sites. So you can move seed longer distances. You can procure your seed from longer distances if you're planting in a warm site. So one can take this climate distance matrix and convert it to a relative height matrix using this transfer function. So we substitute these values into the transfer function to get this relative height matrix. And this tells us that you would get 100% of the height if you were to transfer within to your own ecosystem, and you'd lose, in this case, 11% if you moved from bunchgrass XW2 to to bunchgrass XH1. So that's with no assisted migration. If we want to introduce assisted migration, all we do is add the migration distance. So look over on the left-hand side of the screen. Here's with assisted migration. We just added the climate migration distance to these plantation ecosystems, recalculated this distance matrix, substituted these numbers back into the transfer function to get a new relative height matrix. That's all we've done to introduce assisted migration. Oh, and before I move on, I just want to make one final point on this slide, and that is, what happens when we're talking about orchard seed? I mean, for wild stand seed, it's obvious. You know the ecosystem or the seed zone where your seed came from, and all seed lots are stored with their coordinates and with the ecosystem identifier. But with orchard seed, your parents might come from 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 or 6 ecosystems. So to which ecosystem do you assign an orchard seed lot? So we, the way we resolve that is to take the climate mean of all the parents in the orchard and calculate which ecosystem has a climate that is closest to the mean of the parents. So it's fairly straightforward, and so that's how we are currently assigning orchard seed lots to ecosystems. Okay, let's move on to sort of some of the BC experience with building and implementing a CBST system. So we started back in 2011 with a science working group, 7 folks from within the ministry and Tong Li from UBC. And we started toying with ideas. And Then a couple of years later, we presented some of our ideas to the forest genetics section, so mostly the tree breeders and other scientists in our group. Then we developed that tool that we were looking at a few minutes ago, developed a technical report, which was then sent out to 17 external scientists to review. More discussions with the forest genetics section. We then formed 2 working groups, a policy working group and a stakeholder working group, each consisting of about 15 or 16 folks from ministry and outside of ministry. And we got their feedback. In fact, these groups met, I think each group met face-to-face 3 times. And I can't count the number of times we met online. We then took some input from the Adapt Tree report at UBC, and again, more forest genetics reviews. And then finally in 2017, the Chief Forester approved an expedited alternative process to get this going. So folks could use the new system with an alternative permission. It was finally implemented into SPAR, the Seed Planning and Registry tool, in 2018, and then it became law in 2018. We made minor revisions. Now, at this point in 2018, it was optional. One could still use the old geographic-based system, but as I mentioned at the onset, this geographic-based system is actually being rescinded a week from yesterday. So yeah, it'll be gone. So folks will be obligated to use CBST starting next week. That working group got together and we discussed the pros and cons in excruciating detail of these 3 systems. And we prioritized each of our, but this is not the priority here, but we actually identified 6 or 7 criteria. We weighted them and we came up with a decision to use the focal zone seed transfer system. So just to give you a little bit of context about implementation in BC, as with BC, as with Alberta, most of our land is public, so that has a very different implications if you were to compare yourself with, say, the Pacific Northwest. We have the Chief Forester Standards, which is basically the regulations around well, these fall out of the regulations around reforestation. So everybody is beholden to the standards and everybody uses the same standards. CBST is actually, on a day-to-day basis, is implemented through this seed planning and registry, which is our provincial system for registering seed, ordering seed, tracking seed, and finding seed, everything seed. Registering parents in the orchard is done on SPAR. So having a system like this greatly facilitates the coordinated implementation of a system like CBST. Then this paper in 2006, the Hammond and Wang so-called flying beck zone paper, in which foresters saw their deer beck zones shift wildly with climate change modeling. This was a real wake-up call for a lot of foresters, and it really drew their attention. For the public, obviously, these massive fires just on the edge of Kelowna in 2003, and then mountain pine beetle, which really got going just around the same time, maybe a few years earlier. Mountain pine beetle really made people ask, well, what can we do about climate change in the province and in forestry in particular? Because we have, a fairly long history of research in the area of seed movement and gene ecology, this also paved the way for facilitating a new seed transfer system. At the same time, new tools were becoming available. Climate NA, GIS was become very well established by by 2011. But we have these new tools which had previously not really been exploited in the area of seed transfer. There were also some really seminal papers in the area of seed transfer that used multivariate approaches to figure out and use climate to figure out safe seed transfer distances. And then, of course, every year we were getting more and more and better provenance data. So that really paved the way for implementing a CBST system. Our working group identified some very clear objectives. Clearly we wanted to ensure maximum health and productivity. That is why we have a seed transfer system. We wanted to ensure that it was operable. It was, we didn't have too many zones, or it wasn't too onerous for users, but also we wanted to ensure that users could deploy their seed to the maximum safe distances. Here we have 24 wild stand zones, and this was really hampering the ability of foresters to invest in tree improvement and invest in seedlot collections if you can only use it in a small area. So obviously we need to balance carefully the province's interest in maximizing productivity and adaptation with the user's interest in being able to deploy their seed to a maximum possible area. We also wanted a system that was, had minimal complications, and we, of course, we wanted to be able to implement assisted migration into our system. At the same time, we had really good support from the Forest Genetics Council, from our manager and supervisors, as well as the executive, the Ministry of Forest executive, including the chief forester. So all of that was definitely made life easy for us. We had established relationships with academia, with the Forest Genetics Council, and with the Canadian Forest Genetics Association through our participation in those groups. And as I mentioned already, we had this technical working group. We formed a policy working group with 15, 16 folks, as well as a stakeholder working group. And we put a lot of, I can't emphasize enough how important it was to put effort into really engaging these individuals in the process and making them feel as if they were, truly incorporating their input. We had many meetings with these folks and listened to them very carefully. We also, I think we, between our science working group, the group of us, I think we probably gave over 150 presentations, workshops, conferences, online presentations, tours. This was really a lot of work, but in the end, it was well worth the effort. We developed a couple of technical reports, which went a long way to providing some background so that folks had additional confidence in the proposed system. And then we contributed to many reports and newsletters and magazine articles, so that we had a very strong, I guess, policy campaign. All right. Now, if there's how much time? I haven't been paying attention to the time. How much time do I have, Barb?
You're doing well.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Another 10 minutes or so. Okay,
super. Then this slide is to remind me to switch over to the tool. Just wanted to give folks a feel for this tool. So this is the tool that we developed mainly to convince ourselves that we were doing things properly, that there wasn't some goofy hiccup in the system. So, and what I've done is I've expanded it just in the last few days to include Alberta. So I'm just going to give you an example of how this works. So I have a cut block. So you can select I have a seed lot or I have a cut block. You select the species, and here, now this is because I only did this a couple days ago. I only included lodgepole pine. And now I'm going to choose an ecosystem or seed zone in Alberta, and I'm going to press go. Now, when I press go, the system is going to seek ecosystems or seed zones in BC and Alberta that have a climate that is either the same as M53 or slightly warmer, because I'm in I have a cut block mode, so I want to seek seed that's just a bit warmer than M53. So the system now returns a list of, I counted them a little bit earlier, there were 36 ecosystems here from which one can procure seed according to the threshold that we have devised. Okay, and there it is. There's the map of the ecosystems. So I think that M53 is, approximately here. I think others on the line will know better than I, but I think it's about here. So the system is telling us that one can safely procure seed for this ecosystem, for this seed zone, from any of these yellow, and if we click on them, I'm just going to click here. Okay, this is the FP11. If I were to click over here, okay, this is the ICH WK2. So then the system, the system identifies a list of eligible safe procurement seed zones, and then it maps them. It locates where they are, so you get a nice feel for where those ecosystems are in the province. And then lastly, it connects to our seedlot database, and it goes into the seedlot database and it looks for seed in each of these ecosystems. So, example, here's the ICH DK. So we'll go down here and we'll see if there's any, oh, it's been cut off here for some reason. Anyway, not sure why that's happening, but it goes down and now it lists all of the seed lots present in each of these ecosystems or seed zones. And you can sort the system by genetic worth. Okay, so the best seed lot has a genetic worth of 17% greater than wild stand. So the prediction is that you'd get 17% more volume at rotation if you were to plant seed from this ecosystem, from this seed orchard versus wild stand seed. So yeah, and then if you are I won't show you now, but if you are, you can also use the tool to say, I have a seed lot, where can I use it? And you go through the same process. You can enter the seed lot or the seed orchard, enter the species, the Beck variant, where that seed lot is from, and then press go, and it tells you, it gives you a list of where you can deploy that seed lot. So that's it for the tool. I hope that has given you a bit of a feel for some of the decisions around seed lot selection. Oh, actually, I think I have a final slide. Okay, yeah. So in conclusion, yeah, think climate. And I just want to remind folks that lack of provenance tests should not be a barrier to implementing a climate-based seed transfer system. I mean, most jurisdictions already have a seed lot system, so they have implicitly or explicitly decided what a safe seed transfer distance is. So if you're happy with your safe seed transfer, with the size of your seed zones, you can simply calculate the climate space within a zone and apply that to your new system. Okay, and maybe something I didn't mention actually earlier on is that if we were to stick with the status quo with local is best, and in most places in Alberta, the climate is already changed by 2 degrees. So you're already planting seed that is, if you plant local, that seed is adapted to a climate that's 2 degrees colder than the plantation already. And at rotation, it's going to be, to 5 or 6 degrees colder than the plantation climate. If you implement an assisted migration system, you're planting seed that's adapted to that, optimally adapted to that site, say 20 years into the future. So in BC, that's about a half a degree. So you can plant seed that's 2 degrees colder or half a degree warmer at establishment. So I think it should be fairly clear that using assisted migration is actually safer than using the status quo local is best. I just want to remind folks that ecological risks should be very low when we perform assisted migration using tree seedlots that are from ecosystems that are close or very close geographically to the plantation area. No, we're talking 400, 600, 800 kilometers. We're not talking intercontinental transfers. And finally, I just want to reemphasize the importance of stakeholder engagement in this entire process. That was really critical to the success that we were able to achieve. Okay, thank you very much, and open to questions.